Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on network access security. Now, when it comes to security, there's many different aspects that we have to take a look at in computer networking. So in this lesson, we're going to focus on controlling access to your network. So let's go ahead and get started. So now, the first thing that I want to talk to you about when it comes to network access security would be something called an access control list, or what's known as an ACL. And an ACL is a form of filtering that is used to control whether someone, and really I guess I could say someone or something, right? Because it can be based upon the user or it could be based upon the computer. So we'll say whether someone or something should be given access to a network or a system, or really we could talk about, besides networks and the network as a whole, or system meaning a specific computer, access control lists tend to also be sometimes used when it comes to access to individual resources. But since we're talking about network access security, we're going to talk about ACLs in the form of giving access to a network or a system. Now, I mentioned filtering, right? It's a form of filtering. And when it comes to network access, there's three main types of filters that we're going to use. One would be MAC filtering, okay, which MAC stands for Media Access Control, or we've learned in other lessons how we have the MAC address of individual network cards, okay, so we can control based upon whether somebody's coming in from a computer that has a network card that is acceptable to be getting access to the network or an individual computer. We have IP filtering based upon whether you're coming in on the right IP address, okay, coming in from the right network. And then we also have port filtering. Are you coming in via the correct port? And when we want to talk about firewalls and coming in through certain ports. Now you'll notice if you go back to the definition, I kind of mentioned how it's used to control whether someone, and I said or something. The reason I wanted to emphasize the something is because, well, all three types of filtering that we're talking about here really kind of have to do with more of the something, right? It's not so much looking at if a specific user has access, but if the user is coming in via a computer, meaning that something has the right MAC address, the right IP address, or is coming in on the right port. And that's why I wanted to make sure we're not confused there. I mean, it's still a person who typically is doing something. I mean, even if it's an application, it's still the user who's making the request. And that's why we think of it as a way to control whether someone has access, but really it's something has access. The computer has the right level of access based upon its MAC address, IP address, or port. Now, another thing that I want to talk to you about when it comes to network access is that's all great. We can have, these different access control lists determining, if people can come in from certain computers based upon certain criteria. But what about being a little bit secure about that access, right? We're going to go ahead and give them access because they're coming from the right place. Great. But what if we need to go ahead and gain that access from outside the secure walls of our offices? Well, then we need to talk about something called a VPN, or a virtual private network. Because a VPN is what's used to securely extend that internal network, right? We have that internal network within the walls of our office buildings. Well, what happens when we have, what's much more realistic in today's world, people who aren't always within those secure walls? Well, the VPNs are used to securely transmit information back and forth outside of your internal network. Now, how is this done? Well, it's done through the use of something called a VPN protocol. And there's a number of VPN protocols that are available. We have one called point-to-point tunneling protocol, or PPTP. It is essentially what was one of the original VPN protocols. It still exists today. It's still considered to be a pretty secure tunneling protocol. And when I say tunneling, there's another term for tunneling, and that would be encryption. Okay, it's a form of encryption protocol. And to be more specific than that, I can tell you that there's something called MPPE, which is the Microsoft point-to-point encryption method that is used. Okay, so you can go all the way back to things like Windows 95. Those systems used the point-to-point tunneling protocol. But even in today's world, even the most recent of operating environments still support PPTP. And the reason why is because even though, yeah, we're probably good, I don't have the exact year that PPTP was created, but we're probably close, if not have exceeded 20 years since this protocol was created. It's still considered to be pretty reliable. But to move on from there, we have something called L2TP, the Layer 2 tunneling protocol. This is considered to be a more secure tunneling protocol, and it uses something called IPsec, Internet Protocol Security, as its encryption protocol. And as a matter of fact, speaking of IPsec, there is such a thing as an IPsec tunnel. Okay, so this is an encryption tunnel that is created, and it's not necessarily specific to VPN. I know I have it listed here as a VPN protocol, but it is considered to be a direct tunneling protocol that can be used for secure communications. And there is another protocol that I want you to be familiar with. It's a term. It's ISA-KMP, which stands for the Internet Security Association and Key Management Protocol. And this is used for the establishment of what's called security associations within an IPsec tunnel. Now, I'm not going to go into any more detail than what I just told you. Okay, I'm going to tell you that straight out, and you might be feeling right now like I've just kind of given you just a little dabbling of something, but what does that really mean? Well, the reason I'm not going into it is because we're kind of trying to, I don't want to get outside the scope of where we're at. You know, if this was a Security Plus course, well, I would probably talk to you for the next 20 minutes all about IPsec and ISA-KMP. But right now, I want you to know it more from an existence perspective. You need to know that VPNs are used for making these secure connections from outside your company, and very often that means via the internet, right? Meaning a very unsecure network. And you need to know that PPTP and L2TP are the VPN protocols, and IPsec, or more specifically an IPsec tunnel, can also be used. And then again, how is key management done? How do we have our security associations done in IPsec? With ISA-KMP. Why do I want you to know this? Because I want you to be able to have a somewhat educated discussion with your security professionals within your organization if you're going to be a network administrator. Now, if you are striving to be one of those security professionals, well then guess what? You have more to learn. Okay, you need to move on to a Network Plus or some kind of networking certification or a networking lesson where you'll learn all about this. Now, moving forward through the discussion of security, there is a little bit more that you need to know if you're going to have that educated conversation with a security professional. And that is that there are some other encryption methods, one called SSL, which stands for Secure Sockets Layer. And SSL is typically used where you're very possibly familiar with it if you've seen secure websites, right? When you go to a website that is HTTPS instead of just HTTP, very often you're using SSL. And another form of security besides SSL that is also used with web servers, and we're going to talk in a minute here how it's not just web servers, but that's something called TLS, which stands for Transport Layer Security. And I can tell you that the most recent version of Transport Layer Security is something called TLS 2.0. And what I want to tell you is that SSL and TLS, they're not just used for web servers. That might be the most common place where you will see them used, but it's not the only place that they're used. As a matter of fact, SSL can be used specifically for VPNs. And there is a VPN protocol out there called SSTP, which is the Secure Sockets Tunneling Protocol. Okay, so that's something that is also out there and available, and it's the idea of establishing a VPN connection using SSL. So there's a lot of different options out there. And like I said, I know this is kind of a lot that I'm throwing at you all at once, and I don't have the time here without creating a whole nother course to go into the inner workings and the details of each of these protocols and how exactly they do their encryption, but you need to be able to understand the general idea that this stuff is all out there and available. Now, I mentioned about the VPNs very often being connectivity over an unsecure network, and most typically that unsecure network is the internet. And there are two main forms of VPNs. One is called client-to-site VPN. This is what was originally thought of as the, generically, if you just said set up a VPN, you were talking about client-to-site, meaning you had some remote user who's somewhere else. And in the illustration here, I have a picture of maybe they're at their home, right? So maybe you have a telecommuter, somebody who's working from home, and they need to be able to connect in to the corporate office, and they need to be able to do it securely. And what you're really doing is it's not just that that user connects in, it's that you've extended the office network out to that user's home. And although that's the picture that I have here, you could also have a user who's out in a hotel, in an airport, a coffee shop, somebody else's office, right? You go out to a client office. But the idea here is you have an individual client and you need to extend your network out to that client. But another type of VPN, which is also used, is what's known as site-to-site VPN. And this is a way of extending your office out to, let's say, a branch office. And the branch office and the local office, maybe there's a more cost-effective way than having a direct, secure line. And that way is via VPN across the internet. If both offices have internet connectivity, well, you now have the ability to go ahead and on both ends, you essentially set up both the VPN server and the VPN client so that somebody from either office can make a connection to somebody or something in the other office. Whereas I should mention, if we go back to the client to site, typically you have a VPN client out, we'll say the employee's home, and the VPN server is in the office. And the idea here is the VPN server has the, of course, higher level of responsibility in the sense of validating the client as being somebody who is acceptable to come on in. And by the way, how do they do that? How do they validate that that client is acceptable? Well, we go back to, to some extent, our access control lists and our filtering, right? Is that user coming in from a specific MAC address if we want to get that specific with it? Are they coming in from a specific IP address? Are they coming in via a specific port? Or maybe we're even going down to ACL filtering when it comes to, is it the right user coming in? And I can tell you it goes even further than that. You can set up things that talk about, is the user coming in during the correct time of day? There's all sorts of different settings that a VPN server can use to help control whether a client gets in. And again, remember, in site-to-site, you're going to have VPN servers on both sides so that either site can go ahead and get a hold of the other site and do so securely via the internet. Now, we've talked a whole lot about the idea of VPN. And I mentioned to you just a moment ago about how we have different forms of control when it comes to the filtering and this and that. And I will tell you that the way this is all done is through something called remote access, or we could say remote access solutions, or an acronym that I have here, RAS, which is the remote access service. Now, this service is different depending on what platform you're using. So, for instance, if we were in the world of Microsoft, I can tell you that we have something called the Routing and Remote Access Service, or RAS. And then within that RAS, there is the Remote Access Service component. There are other terms here that I want you to be familiar with that all have to do with the possibility of remote connectivity. They're not all literal to the VPN or direct remote access service, but we do have something called PPP, which is the point-to-point protocol, which is just that. It's a protocol that is used to allow point-to-point communication or remote access communication. There's another version of this point-to-point protocol, which is PPP-oE, which is point-to-point protocol over Ethernet, which allows the point-to-point protocol to be encapsulated within Ethernet frames. And an example of where you see this very often is within DSL solutions. So if you have DSL at home, so maybe you have a DSL provider, you may have seen this term. You've seen PPPoE. We have RDP, which stands for the Remote Desktop Protocol. And this is a neat protocol that is very heavily used these days in the sense that you have users, or I'm going to get more specific than just saying users. I'm going to say you have the IT users, okay, or the IT network management users. The person watching this, the people who want to manage different systems, you'll use the remote desktop protocol to go ahead and connect to a remote system and see that system's actual desktop on your system so that it's as though you've gone over to that other computer. Okay, so it's a different type of remote access. There are internet-based remote access solutions that use the remote desktop protocol. If you've ever heard of something called Log Me In, that's one that I use. And there are a number of them out there. That's the one that I tend to use the most. There is a service called Log Me In where you can install a client out on a given system. And I'll give you an example where I use it. I have the Log Me In client installed on my home computer so that when I'm at the office, if my wife calls me and says, help, I'm trying to do something on the computer and I'm kind of lost. It's not working for me. I can then go to the Log Me In website, log in with my credentials, and I can see my home computer as though I'm sitting there. And then I can help my wife navigate to what she's doing. I will tell you that I use this service in the opposite direction as well, where I have it installed on my work computer so that if I go home, right, if I'm sitting at home and somebody from the office says, hey, can you help me out with such and such? And I say, oh, you know what, that's on my computer at the office. No problem. I go ahead and log in and it's as though I'm sitting at my work computer. This is all done via the remote desktop protocol. The next term that I want you to be familiar with when it comes to remote access solutions is something called ICA, which stands for the Independent Computing Architecture. And this is actually a proprietary protocol which is used for an application server system which was designed by Citrix Systems. Okay, so if you're in a Citrix environment and you're setting up a Citrix remote access solution, you will do so using the Independent Computing Architecture, or ICA. And then there is one last term that I want to wrap things up here with you, and it's something called SSH, which stands for Secure Shell. And Secure Shell is something that was created to basically take the place of something else called Telnet, which is where you can kind of do some remote management of a system. But Secure Shell was created to basically create, I guess the easy way to present it to you would be to create a secure, or we could say a more secure environment to be doing this remote management. Okay, so SSH is a network protocol for secure data communication, especially, and to be more specific, when it comes to remote management. And again, another way of thinking about it is that SSH is the newer Telnet, the more secure Telnet. And so that brings us to the end of this lesson. And at this point, you hopefully now should know how to better control access to your network. That's all I got. See you in the next lesson.